Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're diving into some really cool material you sent us about consumer behavior and how brands use psychology, even neuroscience, to get us to buy their stuff.
Yeah, and to help us navigate this deep dive, we'll be using Roger Dooley's Brainfluence, 100 Ways to Persuade and Convince Consumers with Neuromarketing.
I gotta say, the idea of neuromarketing is pretty fascinating. What's that all about? Sounds kind of like mind control.
Well, it's not quite mind control, but it does get into how our subconscious works. Neuromarketing uses technology like fMRI and EET to measure what's going on in the brain. These tools can help us understand how people respond to different marketing things, giving us insights into stuff like attention, emotional engagement, and even memory.
So instead of just asking someone if they like a product, you can actually see their brain react to it. That's pretty cool.
Exactly. It's about going deeper than self-reported data, getting a more objective look at what's happening in the brain.
Okay, I'm hooked. Let's dive into Dooley's book. What was one of the most surprising things you learned?
One of the most interesting concepts is the power of touch. It might seem subtle, but physical sensations play a huge role in how we see things.
I can definitely see that. We all know a firm handshake makes a good first impression, right?
That's a great example. A firm handshake can actually trigger the release of oxytocin, which is a hormone that's associated with trust and bonding. But it goes even further than that. Dooley talks about this study where people who got a massage were actually more likely to return money to a stranger.
Wait, a massage makes you more trustworthy? That's wild. Wonder if it works with a foot rub.
Well, not sure about a foot rub specifically, but the idea is fascinating, right? The study suggests that physical touch, even something as simple as a massage, can increase our oxytocin levels, and that, in turn, influences how we act.
Okay, so how does this apply to marketing? Are we suggesting companies start giving out free massages to customers?
Not necessarily, but it does show how important it is to think about touch in those customer interactions, when it makes sense, of course. Think about how a product feels, how much a shopping bag weighs, even the texture of a business card. Those little details can subconsciously affect how we view a brand.
That's really interesting. Makes you think about those stores that encourage you to touch and try things on. They must be on to something.
Absolutely. And that leads us right into the idea of sensory branding. Dooley argues that brands should appeal to all five senses, not just what we see. Think about the sound of a Harley-Davidson engine, the smell of fresh coffee, the taste of a really good cocktail.
I remember Dooley talking about this study with scented pencils. Apparently, using an unusual scent like tea tree oil actually helped people remember things better.
The interesting thing there is our brains handle new smells differently, which creates stronger associations. So using the unique scent can really make a brand stand out. I mean, think about how strong certain smells are tied to memories, like the smell of your grandma's baking or the cologne your first boyfriend wore.
That makes total sense. Now I'm wondering if I should be burning essential oils while I work. Maybe that's the key to remembering everything I read for these deep dives.
It's certainly something to think about. But for now, let's move on to another cool topic from the book, Pricing Psychology.
Oh yeah, this was a big one. Dooley talks about something called decoy pricing, and it totally blew my mind.
It is pretty fascinating. Basically, decoy pricing is about adding in a less desirable option to make your target product seem way more appealing.
The example in the book with the shaving gel was so smart. They had 3 sizes, small, medium, and large, but the large one was the same price as the medium one. Suddenly, that large can seemed like an amazing deal.
And brain scans actually show us what happens in our brains when we see this. When we have 3 choices, our brains try to find the easy comparison. The decoy option is like a little nudge toward the choice the brand wants us to make.
It's like our brains are getting tricked. So how can we, the consumers, avoid falling for this?
Well, knowing about the tactic is a good start, but it's also helpful to think about what you actually need and want. Don't just jump at what looks like the best deal.
So slow down, think about what you need, and don't let those clever marketers sway you. Makes sense.
Exactly. And this decoy pricing thing is related to a bigger idea called anchor prices.
Oh yeah, tell me more about that.
Think about companies like Apple. They launch a new iPhone at a really high price, setting that initial anchor. Then when they drop the price later, it seems like a steal, even if it's still pretty expensive.
That's so true. I've totally fallen for that before. They make us think a certain price is normal, so anything less feels like a win.
Right. And this applies to more than just iPhones. Think about how you might use this when you're negotiating your salary or setting prices for your own products or services. You can set that higher initial anchor to make what you want seem more reasonable.
Wow, that's a really helpful takeaway. Lots to think about here. Okay, what else did Dooley cover that just blew your mind?
Well, another point he makes is about the impact of words. We all know words matter, but it was surprising to learn how much our brains are wired to respond to certain kinds of language.
Yes, he talks about how even the font and wording on a restaurant menu can affect how we see a dish.
Exactly. For example, there was this study that found that people were willing to pay more for a digit that had fancier words and was printed in a harder-to-read font.
So fancier words equal fancier food in our brains. Incredible.
It all goes back to cognitive fluency. Our brains love things that are easy to understand. Simple words, clear fonts, those things feel familiar and safe. But when something takes more mental effort, like trying to figure out a complicated description, our brains tend to think it's more valuable.
It's like we think, well, if it took me longer to read, it must be more important.
Right, and this applies to all kinds of visual communication. So if you want something to seem sophisticated or exclusive, using more complex language and visuals can actually work, even if it's subtle.
This deep dive makes me want to redo my whole website. Okay, fonts, check. What else could Dooley talk about that we should discuss?
Well, he spent a whole chapter on one of the best attention grabbers. Babies.
Of course, everyone loves babies. But is there actually a scientific reason for that?
There is. Research shows our brains are hardwired to react to baby faces. Brain scans actually show a spike in activity in the emotional parts of our brains just milliseconds after seeing a baby's face.
So it's not just society, it's biological.
Seems that way. That's why marketers have used babies in advertising forever. It almost guarantees positive emotions and gets your attention.
I guess that makes sense, but I also wonder if there's an ethical side to this. Are we being manipulated when brands use babies in their marketing?
That's a good question. And I think it's important to be aware of these tactics so we can make smarter choices as consumers.
Absolutely. Now, before we go any further, let's take a quick break. We'll be back with the last part of our deep dive into Brainfluence right after this.
Welcome back to the Deep Dives. Hope you're ready for more from Roger Dooley's Brainfluence because we're just getting started.
Definitely am. Can't wait to hear more about what makes consumers tick, especially all that subconscious stuff we don't even realize is happening.
Well, speaking of subconscious influences, let's talk about free. You mentioned it before the break, but Dooley has a whole chapter on it, and it's really interesting.
Oh, yeah. The power of free is crazy. Dooley uses this great example of an experiment with chocolate, a Hershey's Kiss, and a Lindt truffle. So in one scenario, they offered the truffle for 14 cents and the Kiss for 1 cent. Most people pick the truffle. Makes sense, right? It's the better chocolate.
Right. Seems like the logical choice.
Exactly. But then they offered the truffle for 13 cents and the Kiss for free. Guess what happened?
Let me guess. People went for the free Kiss, even though it was only a 1 cent difference.
You got it. It totally changed how people acted. It seems almost crazy, but free is incredibly powerful.
It really is. Psychologically, free taps into our aversion to loss. We're actually more driven to avoid losing something than we are to gain something of the same value.
It's like we're obsessed with getting something for nothing. Dooley mentions how even a tiny fee can totally ruin a promotion that feels free.
That's right. He talks about how Amazon's free shipping actually failed in France because they added a small fee instead of making it totally free.
I remember that. Seems so weird, but that little fee changed everything.
It did. So the takeaway is free can be an amazing marketing tool, but it has to be really free. No hidden costs or anything.
So if you want to motivate people, that free element can be a game changer.
Absolutely. Now, let's switch gears for a second and talk about something that might surprise you, how gender affects marketing.
Yes. Dooley talks about how research shows men and women often react differently to marketing.
He does. For instance, he mentions studies that suggest men prefer simpler wording, while women might be more drawn to descriptions and more elaborate language.
He uses the J. Peterman catalog as an example. With its long, detailed descriptions, it might appeal more to women, but it's important to remember these are just general patterns. Everyone's different.
Of course, we can't just make huge generalizations, but understanding these patterns can be helpful when you're making marketing campaigns aimed at specific groups.
It's all about knowing your audience and what speaks to them. Speaking of speaking to an audience, what about visuals? I mean, we see images constantly. How much actually sticks with us?
That's a great question. Dooley highlights some really cool research about this. For example, he talks about a study where vivid images in print ads actually created false memories in people.
Wait, really? You mean an ad can make me think I ate something I didn't?
It sounds crazy, but that's what the research suggests. The study used an ad for a fake popcorn brand, but the images were really appealing. And a lot of people later said they remembered actually trying the popcorn, even though it didn't exist.
That's wild and kind of scary. It makes you realize how strong images can be.
It does. From a marketing point of view, it shows how important it is to use strong visuals that people will remember.
It also makes you think about how much our senses are connected to our memories. The right image, sound, or smell can trigger all kinds of associations and feelings.
Absolutely. And speaking of sensory influences, Dooley brings up another surprising thing, The weight of a document.
Okay, now I'm curious. What does a document's weight have to do with anything?
Well, believe it or not, studies have shown that, for example, a heavier resume can actually make people think the candidate is more serious and competent.
Seriously. So I should print my resume on cardstock. Just kidding. But that's wild.
It is interesting, right? Seems random, but it goes back to our instincts. We connect weight with substance and importance. Think about how we see a heavy book compared to a thin pamphlet.
That's true. We almost automatically assume a heavier thing is more valuable or important. So how can we use this?
It's something to consider when you're designing anything that people will actually hold. The weight of a product, the thickness of a brochure, even how heavy a business card feels, these can subtly change people's perceptions.
This reminds me of when Apple released the first iPad. People were surprised by how thin and light it was. Could that have been a strategy to make it seem more modern and innovative?
It's definitely possible. Now, talking about subtle cues, Dooley also gets into fonts.
Oh yeah, that surprised me too. I had no idea fonts could have such a big impact on what we do.
They really can. Dooley talks about this study where people got exercise instructions printed in either a simple or complex font. The people who read the instructions in the harder-to-read font actually thought the exercise would take almost twice as long.
So a fancy, hard-to-read font made them think the exercise was tougher.
Exactly. Goes back to cognitive fluency again. If something's easy to process, our brains kind of dismiss it. But if it takes more mental effort, we think it's more valuable.
It's like we think, if it took me longer to read, it must be important.
Right, and this applies to all kinds of visual communication. So if you want to make something feel sophisticated or exclusive, a more complex font can be a subtle but effective way to do it.
This deep dive makes me want to redesign my whole website. Okay, fonts, check. What else does Dooley cover that we should talk about?
Well, he has a whole chapter on one of the most reliable attention grabbers, babies.
Of course, everyone loves babies. Is there a scientific reason for that, though?
There is. Research shows that our brains are hardwired to respond to baby faces. Brain scans actually show a burst of activity in the emotional parts of our brains within milliseconds of seeing a baby's face.
So it's not just society, it's biological.
Seems like it. That's why marketers have been using babies in advertising forever. It's almost guaranteed to make people feel good and grab their attention.
It makes sense, but I also wonder about the ethics of it. Are we being manipulated when brands use babies in their ads?
That's a good question, and I think it's important to be aware of these tactics so we can make smarter choices as consumers.
Absolutely. Now, before we go any further, let's take a quick break. We'll be back with the final part of our deep dive into Brainfluence right after this.
Welcome back to the Deep Dive.
We're wrapping up our exploration of Roger Dooley's Brainfluence, and this book has really changed how I see marketing.
It's been an interesting journey. We've uncovered so many cool insights about how our brains react to these messages.
We've talked about touch, free, gender, even the weight of a resume.
It's crazy how many subtle things affect our perceptions and choices.
So as we finish up, what are some key takeaways for our listeners?
Well, one of the biggest things from Brainfluence is that a lot of our decisions are driven by unconscious factors.
Right. We like to think we're rational, but there's so much going on that we don't even realize.
Exactly. And that's why just asking people what they think, like in traditional market research, isn't always enough. We don't always know why we do things. Neuromarketing helps us see those hidden motivations.
It's like seeing behind the scene of a magic trick.
That's a great way to put it. Another big idea is sensory branding.
Yeah, engaging all 5 senses, not just visuals, can make a much bigger impact.
Think about walking into a store with a signature scent, music playing, and maybe even product samples. Those sensory cues create a strong emotional connection to the brand.
It's a more immersive experience, and it ties back to those unconscious things we were talking about. Sometimes we don't even know why we're attracted to a brand or product. It just feels right.
Exactly. Now, something Dooley talks about a lot is scarcity.
Oh yeah, the idea that we value things more when they're hard to get.
Right. Our brains are wired to want what we can't have. Limited time offers, exclusive deals, those only a few left messages, they all play on our fear of missing out.
It's like Black Friday when everyone goes nuts trying to get the best deals. But scarcity can be used in a good way too, right?
Definitely. Think about charities that emphasize limited time or resources to help people in need.
It makes people feel like they need to act fast. So it's all about how you use these techniques.
Exactly. And talking about powerful techniques, we can't forget storytelling.
The stories connect with people on a deeper level. Dooley says our brains are wired for narratives. We're more engaged, more emotionally invested, and more likely to remember a message told as a story.
Think about how we remember fables and parables. Those stories teach us, and we remember them long after we hear them.
So instead of just listing features and benefits, brands should focus on telling a good story.
Yeah, it's about connecting with people emotionally and drawing them in.
This deep dive has been amazing. I feel like I have a much better understanding of how marketing works and all the psychology behind it.
Glad to hear it.
And to our listeners, we hope this deep dive gave you some aha moments and new ways to think about marketing and consumers. Thanks for joining us on the Deep Dive 8